Edexcel iGCSE Poetry has two poetry questions. So you've got the section A, unseen poetry, and the section B, anthology poetry. So we're going to have a look at the anthology poetry in this lesson today. I'm just going to break down an exam question for you and show you an approach of what to do for that question and give you a little bit of an example of a plan. So I'll kind of show you how I would personally plan this question as well. So yeah, hopefully it's useful for you and it'll just get you a bit more used to planning and approaching the question, make it a little bit less scary and more approachable. So we'll jump right in. There's basically an option of two questions here, and they will give you two poems in the first one. So here you can see reread Search for My Tongue and Half Caste compare how writers present concerns about language in those poems. That one gives you two poems that you have to do. The other option is they give you one poem that you have to do and you compare it to one other poem from the anthology. So what that means is you should really revise all of the poems in detail, but you can get away with doing a few a bit less than others, because if there's some poems you just really hate or you just don't click with them, you're not confident writing on them, that's okay, because you always have this option in your second question to do just one poem plus another from the anthology. And the really bad poem that you hate might come up here, but then you do have this other, option where you're given two poems as well, if that makes sense. So basically, ideally learn all of them in detail, but if there are some that you hate, just kind of ignore those. Maybe up to 3, I would suggest you can just sort of, don't skip them, but just do them sort of lightly and hope they don't come up, and you should be fine. That's my sort of suggested take on it. But hopefully, if you feel comfortable with poetry, you can get kind of a decent essay out of any poem, and even if it's not your favourite poem, you should have quite a lot to say about it if you've researched it well. So if you've got poems where you don't know what to say or you don't know what you're doing with them, probably the main thing that you need to do is just research more, revise more, get to a point where you understand how other people talk about them, and then you can use those ideas in your essay. You don't have to come up with all of the ideas yourself. So yeah, now that we've got that kind of out of the way, we'll have a look a bit more at the question. I'm going to take the first one because it's harder, because it gives me two poems together. So I feel like this is a more difficult one because I don't have any options here. You'll notice as well it says 40 minutes on your chosen question. You can go over a little bit, but you don't want to go over by more than 5 minutes. So I would suggest kind of 40 to 45 minutes for this question, which actually is a really, really tight time frame given that it's a comparative essay. I'm going to show you in a minute how to structure that, and I really recommend sticking to this very rigid structure that I give you for this question, because I think if you go and do any other kinds of comparative structures here, because the time is so short to write this essay, it's going to be just a bit too difficult for you. So yeah, later in the video I'll go through that more. But yeah, first we're going to just break down this question. So we have two poems, Search for My Tongue, Half Caste. Compare how writers present concerns about language in these poems. Every question that you're given in a literature exam will have what's called a focus, and you have to find the focus of the question to basically understand what it is that they want you to do. So here the focus is concerns about language. That is the main concept or the main driving force of what your essay needs to be about. What that means is language, basically. If you don't understand what concerns about language is, then you could just kind of narrow it down to language. How do the writers present language in Search for My Tongue and Half Caste? That would give you a totally fine essay. So sometimes, if you're really stuck with essay questions and you don't quite understand every single word, it's okay as long as you understand the focus. Make sure that you don't answer on a question where you don't know what the focus is. So yeah, language or concerns about language. Concerns is sort of like worries, problems, issues, things that are difficult, perhaps problematic, that type of thing. It suggests as well that you should make reference to language, form and structure. That means you have to, if you're aiming for a top mark, analyse those three things equally. Don't just do language analysis and ignore form and structure. Make sure that you do know what those three things are and how to do them, and you don't just, only do structure or only do form. That is something for another video though. We're not going to address that here. And you support your answer with examples from the poem. So that means you need to have quotations ready that you can use confidently in these poems. So it does say reread the poems as well. So that means it gives you the anthology. You're not expected to just kind of memorize all the quotes, but I would recommend sort of having a quotes list kind of at least half memorized so that you are confident with the quotes you're using. If you just use a quote that you've never used before and you just pick it at random because you're panicked in the essay, it will probably not work out that well, because when people get really high grades on literature essays, there's a feeling like they've analysed this quote before and they've thought about it in detail and they've kind of picked it apart and they know what to say about it. They know how to keep going deeper and deeper into it to get more meaning out of it. So it's really important to be confident and comfortable with the quotes that you're using, even if they do give you the poems. So we've got a comparative essay, we've got the focus on language, and we've got our two set poems, Search for My Tongue and Half Caste. I'm going to show you here how I would break that down. I'm just going to type for a second, it might be a little bit loud. We'll see. The focus is language. The poems are Search for My Tongue and Half Caste. Step 1 is I'm going to just think about these poems totally separately. I'm not going to try and compare them right away because I wouldn't really know where to start. I'm just going to think about how does Search for My Tongue deal with the idea of language, especially concerns about language, so issues with language. And I'm just going to think of themes or kind of messages or meanings that come up to do with that topic of language. So there's the mother tongue versus the acquired, or I don't know what you call it, like the second language tongue, the acquired tongue that she's had to learn in her country that she's emigrated to. So there's this kind of competition between languages there. There's actually like a kind of visual battle between those languages going on the page, because if you look at an example of this poem, it has the Hindi next to the English, and they compete for space on the page in the same way that the kind of quite grotesque image of tongues are competing in the mouth of the speaker. We have this idea that language is connected to identity, which isn't really a concern usually, but in the poem it is, because she feels like by losing her language, she's also losing her identity. We also have a feeling about the way that the subconscious uses language in dreams to kind of communicate to us. That is a bit of a weird point that is kind of complex, so I might not end up using that in the essay, but it is a point about language and concerns about language that I could maybe use. I'm trying to think if there's any more in Search for My Tongue off the top of my head. There is a concern that language is an expression of culture. So through the language you speak, you express your culture, and if you lose the language of your native culture, you also lose some of your cultural background or your heritage with that. You might also have a feeling that some languages are kind of dominant and oppressive. So we have this feeling that English is a very oppressive language for the speaker, because she just feels like controlled by it, because it's not what she wants to be speaking, but she's forced to. So there's a sort of link between colonialism and language, and language being used as a tool for oppression of people's individuality. Another thing might be that language is powerful, and it can kind of communicate strong ideas across time to people. So if we think of the poem as something that we're reading, it's a piece of language that we're experiencing, then yeah, it makes a very powerful statement. It's not necessarily a concern so much about language, so I might not put that in the essay. So you can see what I'm doing here is, I've not thought of this question before the lesson, by the way, so I'm just kind of talking aloud as I think, which is why it comes out a little fragmented. But what I'm doing is I'm thinking through all of the ways that the poem connects to the focus of this question. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same for half cast. I'm not going to compare them yet, like I say. Just treat the poems totally separately in step 1, so that you're basically just, it's kind of easier if you just deal with them one by one. And when you have dealt with them one by one, then you can compare. So I'll show you in a second, once I've done half cast, how I'll compare after that. So yeah, half cast, how does Agard talk about language? So again, I mean, there's a lot of similar things. There is a a native language versus acquired kind of second language. There's also a fragmentation of language in half cast, because he is, so Agard's a Guyanese poet, and he speaks what we call Creole, which is a kind of mixed sort of mashup of different languages. And yeah, he uses Guyanese Creole to actually write the poem. The poem's not even technically written in English, it's written in a kind of Creole which uses pieces of English but fragmented with a range of other kind of dialects and other linguistic influences in there. So there's a fragmentation of language, which actually makes it kind of creative and playful in a way. There's a really similar idea, I'm not going to compare yet, but there is this idea of language as powerful and a political tool, especially in the culture of the Caribbean. Literature and poetry is regarded as hyper-political, and it's not just there for fun or for entertainment. It actually has a kind of social purpose or message within the context of Caribbean literature and Caribbean poetry. So the sort of purpose of that poem is not just to poke fun at something, it's to actually make quite a serious social point, like a social message. What else do we have? I think we have the idea that language expresses kind of culture and background. We have the idea that identity is tied to language, so really similar kind of point to the one above. What else does he say in half cast? I remember actually being really shocked by this poem the first time I read it, which was when I was still in school, because I studied it as well when I was at school. And one girl once called me half caste because I'm half Indian and half English, or half like quarter Pakistani, quarter Indian, half English. And yeah, I just remember being so shocked that someone used this word in real life at me, because I'd read this poem and I'd learned from this poem that it's such a bad word, and you don't call people that. It's like a really offensive term. And yeah, a few weeks after I read this poem in school, someone called me that, and I remember just being like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say or how to react. So yeah, this is a really, really powerful poem. I think it's one of the poems that made an impact on me personally. So you can do that as well, where you connect poems to your personal experiences, or if anything kind of relates to you, you can kind of draw on that for essays. That tends to be quite powerful in terms of what you can say about it. So in the poem, there's this thing about like only half of him is really accepted because one part of his culture is considered sort of superior, I guess, to the other one, which is, he kind of makes the point, it's unfair. So yeah, there's a sense again of dominance of language, and culture is problematic, it causes issues. So yeah, so now what we've got is, if I zoom out a little bit, you can see kind of more. We've got some points for each one that overlaps and some that don't. So what I'm looking for after I've kind of thought of all these different points is I'm looking for things that connect, because I need to write 3 comparative paragraphs. So I don't want to be writing a random point for Search for My Tongue that doesn't connect to Halfcast. They have to connect properly. So yeah, we do have this one connects, the mother tongue versus the acquired tongue, same as this one. We have a sense of it being powerful, but slightly different how it's powerful. So it's politically powerful in Halfcast, whereas it's kind of a sense of personal power in Search for My Tongue. So that's excellent. If you can compare something to a point and then say, actually, they're different beyond this point, that's exactly what they're, what makes a really good comparative essay paragraph. We have this idea that language is connected to identity and language is connected to culture. Both of those are in both of the poems. These are more simple points. I'm not like super happy with those. I think they're kind of more basic. So I tend to try and choose the points once I've got them that I think are more advanced or more personal. We do have this idea of dominance of language as well, and that's oppressive and problematic. Yeah, so you can see actually a few of these points, which are the ones I've not put in bold, they don't connect well. So I'm not going to be making paragraphs out of these because I could talk about one poem really well and I couldn't really compare it to the other one very well. So yeah, so we're going to ignore the ones that don't connect very well. See if I can cross them out. There we go. And then I've got more than enough ideas to make my 3 paragraphs that are left. So yeah, let me see. So basically what you want is 3 separate points that are then going to form what we call the topic sentences for your paragraphs. Yeah, so we might say that in both poems, the dominance of one language over another is presented as problematic. So that's a straight up comparison. Both poems have that as a very strong, clear message. So this is just a fully comparative sentence. That is my topic sentence, so that's the point in the PEE of my paragraph. Then I would do another one, but this time I might try and do what I call a layered comparison. So compare to a point and then have a bit of a contrast. So I might say that although But and Agard present language as powerful, for But it is a source of personal power, whereas Agard sees, or he views it more as a political tool to change society. So this is half comparative, half contrast. It starts by comparing and then it contrasts. You don't want to really bother doing these types of sentences until you're really confident with the comparative structure. So if that feels like a bit much for you at the moment, just do these kind of sentences where you're just comparing. Or you can do a complete direct contrast if you find one too. I'm trying to find a total contrast in these poems. I don't think there is one really. Maybe the native language and acquired second language we could contrast, because yeah, we could say, if I want to do a full contrast, search for my tongue demonstrates the tragic loss of confidence that an individual feels when her second language takes over from her mother tongue. In contrast, Agard is defiant and refuses to speak standard English. In half-caste. Instead, he uses Guyanese Creole. So yeah, that's a long sentence. I wouldn't suggest making your topic sentences any longer than that, by the way. I have a bit of a tendency to slightly overwrite the topic sentence, but this is an example of a full contrast sentence. So when you're making those points for your essays, for your paragraphs in your essays, they can be comparative. They can be what I call a layered comparison, where they compare to a point, then they contrast. But they can be fully contrasting. And it's actually good to do a mixture of all of them, because it shows a bit of a range of comparative skill there. So I think if I was going to do the essay, I would actually just leave my topic sentences this way, because I think those three work really well. All I would do is just add in an intro where I state my thesis. I have other video lessons where I go into that in more detail. If you think that's confusing, feel free to look for them. They're just kind of like, essay writing, comparative writing type lessons that I do. And yeah, and then you would put your conclusion. If you're planning, you don't need to plan the conclusion at all. All you do is you just plan these points, and then you plan your thesis. I always do the thesis after the points, even though it comes before the points in the essay, because I find it easier to make a thesis once I've actually written out what my points are going to be. So yeah, let me have a go at writing a thesis now for you as well, just so you can see what that would be like. If you don't know what a thesis is, it's the last sentence of your intro that would come as a direct answer to the question. And all essays that you write, especially for literature, need a thesis in the intro, because otherwise they end up really floaty and all over the place. So yeah, make sure that you're good at writing theses. So yeah, so I would probably put that, what's the question again? Focus is language, the issues, concerns about language. So I want to use the words of the question in my thesis. Let me see. Yeah, I might say that for the most part, Butt and Agard agree that dominance of second languages that cause the loss of mother tongues create a feeling of dislocation and loss of identity in the people who are forced to speak a second language. Something like that is a good start. It says lost twice. Because I'm trying to think of a synonym for loss. Cause the death of mother tongues, the kind of, sidelining of mother tongues, putting it on the side. I would fiddle around with this if I had more time. I would maybe try and find a slightly better way to express this. Yeah, so for the most part, Bart and I gotta agree that dominance of second languages that cause the sidelining of mother tongues, the neglect, that's a better word, of mother tongues, creates a feeling of dislocation and loss of identity in the people who are forced to speak. People who are forced to, I'll maybe just get rid of that, I think, because it's too long. So yeah, when I write a thesis, as you can see here, what I tend to do is I write out all of my thoughts and then I start kind of cutting it back and refining it so that it's more sharp and clear. So what I've gone for here is a very comparative thesis. This is actually unusual for me when I write compare-contrast essays on poems. Usually I'll find more differences and my thesis will be kind of balanced a little bit like this sentence here. But in this case, I actually feel like they're very similar and they're making very similar points. Usually I would find something a little bit more different about them. So yeah, that's me going through a whole plan. And yeah, it's taken a little while. Obviously in the real exam, you get this down to about 5 minutes. But what I tend to do is this stage here is just in my head. So I don't need to write that out. Once you really know the poems well and you've thought about it, that's usually fine. So the bit that takes you the 5 minutes is the planning of the topic sentences only, and ideally writing your thesis. If you're rushed for time, you don't have to even do that bit. You can just plan your topic sentences. So yeah, that's how to plan for your Edexcel iGCSE poetry, and hopefully it's been useful for you. If you need more help with this, we have a whole Scribbly course on Edexcel iGCSE poetry that has super detailed notes on all of the poems, example answers. I think it's got like 20 official questions that you can practice. It's got mark scheme breakdowns, grade boundaries, just everything that you need basically to get a super high grade on this, including lots of me rambling, more lessons like this about how to do things and how to break stuff down. So yeah, if you found this helpful, check that out. I'll put a link to it in the video description. And yeah, hopefully this has been useful for you. And I'll see you guys soon in some future Scribbly lesson. Goodbye for now.